What I'm going to talk about today is innocent suffering. The frustration of innocent suffering sometimes leads people to question God. They ask, how can there be an all-good, all-powerful God if this kind of thing can happen to us? And of course, this world is full of all kinds of examples of innocent suffering. For example, there's the brutal coronavirus that robs you of a loved one. Or a person gets mistreated simply because of the color of his skin. People around the world suffer from genocide, famine, natural disasters. Maybe you can think about a time when you experienced hardship or suffering without deserving it. In the Old Testament, the classic example of innocent suffering is Job, from whom we hear in the first reading in the Mass today. Job is a very good and righteous man, but he loses his children, he loses all of his property, and he feels totally dejected. And he says in today's first reading, life on earth is a drudgery. My days come to an end without hope. My life is like the wind. I shall not see happiness again. And his friends get together and they think they have the solution to his situation. They tell him, Job, if you're suffering, then that must mean that you're a sinner. And this must be your punishment for something you did wrong. But Job knows that their explanation doesn't hold water because he's been a good man his whole life. He doesn't deserve all that suffering, and he knows it. And so he talks to God honestly, and he lets the Lord know how he feels. And eventually what Job discovers through the course of this book in the Old Testament is that God does not abandon the one who suffers. Even in the midst of suffering, we're in the hands of a good and merciful God. Some people think that if I get close to the church, if I'm close to God, then everything in my life should go well. If God's really doing his job. But that's a little bit mixed up, really. Prayer and devotion are very important. They're essential. But they're not an automatic force field against all pain or suffering in this world. For example, if a tornado hits town, it's not just going to hit the homes of the evil sinners. Some good and innocent people will also get hurt. The fact is that sometimes bad things happen to good people, and sometimes good things happen to bad people. So why is it that innocent people suffer? Why do people go through hardships that they don't deserve? Well, there's lots of different possible explanations. It depends on the situation. For example, sometimes it's because of simple mistakes or negligence. Sometimes it's because of the wrong choices that somebody made. Sometimes it's because of the attacks of the evil one. Sometimes God is testing us or giving us discipline so that we can grow in virtue. And sometimes it's just because this natural world that we live in on this side of heaven is not perfect. Our world has a few kinks in it. Our human bodies are weak, fragile instruments. They don't always work right. So any of those things could be at work when we suffer without deserving it. God doesn't stop all bad things from happening to good people. But what he does is he gives us the grace to take those bad things and turn them to good through his power. We don't choose our afflictions, but what we can choose is what we're going to do with them. So what can we do with our innocent suffering? I'm going to suggest 5 things that we can do as Christians. First of all, we pray. Look, for example, at Jesus in today's gospel passage. It says, rising very early before dawn, he left and went off to a deserted place where he prayed. That was a regular part of the life of Jesus. Think, for example, of what he did the night before he died. He went to the Garden of Gethsemane and he prayed. He was deeply troubled. and he brought it to God his Father in prayer. His intimate union with the Father carried him through his suffering. And the same can be true for us. Our union with God, which we get in touch with through our prayer, can carry us through our pain and our suffering. Another thing that we can do with our suffering is keep an eternal perspective. Because this life that we're living right now is not all there is. The soul that God created for you is immortal. And God's justice is going to be fulfilled in the next life. In the final judgment, the just will be rewarded, and the unjust will be held accountable. But all of that gets sorted out ultimately, completely, in the next life. So we need to live always with an eternal perspective. It's not all going to get straightened out in this world. A third thing we do is that we take our turns helping and being helped as we go through life. For example, when Peter's mother-in-law was in need of healing, Jesus healed her. She accepted the healing power of Jesus, and then she began waiting on others to serve them. Everybody takes their turns, and so in our suffering, we can be humble enough to accept the help of others, and then we pass it on when we can. A fourth thing we can do with our suffering is we become more compassionate. Because we have suffered, we can better relate to others when they suffer. By our suffering, we can become more comfortable sitting by the side of others when they're going through a hard time and struggling. We visit the sick and the dying, and we remind them that they're not alone, and we're not anxious in their presence. We can be in the presence of somebody who's hurting, and by our presence, we give them strength. We do whatever we can to alleviate the suffering of others. That's part of being a compassionate person. Finally, another thing that we do with our suffering is that we join our sufferings to the sufferings of Jesus Christ on the cross. Whenever we choose to accept the elements of pain in our life and we join them to the passion of Christ on the cross, then our suffering becomes a participation in the saving work of Jesus Christ. It has meaning. Our suffering takes on meaning because it becomes redemptive suffering in union with the cross of Jesus. Suffering is not meaningless for the Christian. We can offer our pain and our suffering as a sacrifice, joined with the sacrifice of Christ for the spiritual good of others. So this Christian meaning of suffering that I've just been exploring with you is one of the most precious treasures of our Christian faith. Those who have a solid Christian understanding of the meaning of suffering are sustained by their faith through tragedy and hardship. And they can actually grow in wisdom and holiness passing through their afflictions. Our beautiful Catholic spiritual tradition helps us to make sense out of suffering. And the more we get in touch with this profound wisdom, the better we will be to be equipped to manage the tragedies in our own life, and the better we can encourage our suffering brothers and sisters in their time of need.